And could you please just remind the jury who you are again?
Sure, I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. I am board certified in forensic psychology. I am the president-elect of the trauma division of the American Psychological Association, and I evaluated Amber Heard over 6 visits for approximately 29 hours.
Okay. And why are you here today?
To offer a rebuttal testimony to Shannon Curry's testimony of yesterday.
Okay. Now, Dr. Curry said you used improper methods. Would you agree with that?
No, I would not.
Why? Please explain.
As I testified to you all several weeks ago, I used a standard forensic procedure that is well established in our field. It is a multi-method, multi-hypothesis-driven procedure where you're looking at a variety of different details and tests and external data to arrive at an opinion, and you're looking at the consistency across that data. There are 3 sort of sets of tests that we use as forensic psychologists, and I think that's where it seems that Dr. Curry seems confused. We have forensic assessment instruments. Those are instruments that are very neatly tied to a legal criteria. Those are most notably done in a criminal court for competency. If someone has competency to stand trial, we have very clear measures that can track that legal criteria. The next level are forensically relevant instruments. And those instruments are not linked to a specific legal criteria, but they do have information that's germane to that finding. And that can be an example of a risk assessment measure and a malingering measure. So the malingering measure that I utilized was the MFAST, and that was the only malingering measure in this case. The third category are clinical assessment instruments, and those are instruments that are validated and well-researched and used in the clinical realm as we understand people's symptomatology and diagnostic and functional capacities. Those are things like the MMPI, the PAI, the CAPS, the TSI, because they are clinically relevant and they still give us very valuable information to individuals who are involved in a court case. And the reason that we do that and we use these clinical measures is because the majority of the people that we see are in a clinical realm. They're not in a courtroom. So they're well-validated and well-researched methods. What we also do is use a very different types of tests within that category. We use some checklists, some face-valid checklists. We use some tests that are those broadband personality inventories. We use structured clinical interviews. And then we look for the consistency across those data points. And when we use different types of tests, it gives us information about the individual, how they go about these tests in these different modalities.
Now, Dr. Curry seemed to suggest that Amber Heard tested the most extreme category in all of these different tests. Is that accurate?
Objection, compound.
Overruled.
That is not accurate. They were not on the checklist. I mean, people sometimes do. They go, all the time, this happens to me all the time, frequently. And that is not how she endorsed these tests. She endorsed them in a very moderate way, in a very nuanced way, describing her symptoms that I determined was accurate and reliable.
Now, Dr. Curry also suggested that Amber Heard was tested very, very high, 98th percentile, I think, on malingering and feigning. Could you speak to that, please?
Sure. So, I mean, she said a lot of things, so let's go through those tests. The first was the PAI, and that's that other broadband psychological
Objection,
measure.
non-responsive.
I think it's very responsive.
It's sustained.
Okay. Could you tell the jury about the PAI test that Dr. Curry addressed?
Yes. Thank you. So that's the broadband measure that has validity scales built into it that gives us indications about how the individual goes about the test. I told you last time that there was no evidence of malingering or exaggeration or feigning on that test. What Dr. Curry was talking about was this tendency to put your best foot forward to minimize faults on this PAI. That scale was right at the cusp. And then there are 2 other measures that we look at that to say, you know, is this enough for an elevation for me to consider that as a serious response distortion, of which Dr. Curry was saying, and it was not. What was relevant on this test was there were elevations on anxiety, on affective anxiety, meaning anxiety, tension, worry, on traumatic stress, on hyperactivity, and on affective instability. Those were the 4 scales that were elevated on this test. The borderline scale was not elevated on this test. And this test...
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yes.
So, Dr. Curry, let's
and she kept saying something that MFAST is not for malingered PTSD. That's wrong on a couple of levels. People who are going to malinger and feign don't only feign one diagnosis. They sometimes talk about all different symptoms that they have, and they exaggerate and they make themselves seem much worse than they are. So when you're doing an evaluation, you're giving a malingering measure to get a sense of how this person is responding to this evaluation. Now, what you do is you take those 3 tests that I talked to you about, the PAI, the TSI, and the MFAST, all with valid validity scales. You have greater confidence in your results. And that is in the literature, and that's literature that Dr. Curry cited in her report. That bolsters the methodology that I used. That in the study that had the PAI, the MFAST, and the TSI in the title of detecting feigned from bona fide PTSD.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Curry also talked about the danger assessment scale and suggested that you had inappropriately interpreted that. Do you agree?
That's also incorrect.
Please describe for the jury.
Which I told you last time, the danger assessment scale has statistically validated risk factors for serious or lethal domestic violence. Those risk factors exist whether we go forward, we're sitting with someone in an acute setting and assessing them right now, or if we look backward and we look retrospectively about what factors may have been present in a case that indicated severity. That instrument is used in what we call, there's called domestic fatality review boards. Those are boards after somebody has been killed, a homicide has occurred in a domestic situation. They look at these risk factors to see what was there and what could be done.
Right. Dr. Curry also criticized your administering of the CAPS-5. Do you agree with her criticisms?
I do not.
Will you please explain to the jury?
So the CAPS-5, as you all have heard multiple times, is a structured clinical interview in determining PTSD according to DSM-5 criteria. On this measure, Amber Heard scored in a moderate range. She did not over-exaggerate on this test. She could have said no, mild, moderate, severe, and extreme. All of hers were either 2s or 1s or 0s. None above that. So she's scoring in the moderate range, which still has functional impairments. I mean, we don't want someone to be having moderate PTSD, but that's not an exaggerated profile or exaggerated response style of someone who's answering an instrument.
Right. And the last of these Dr. Curry referred to was the PCL-5. Do you agree with her criticisms of your administration and interpretation of that?
No, so the PCL-5 is a checklist of symptoms of PTSD. It is, as she said, it is a face-valid instrument. It means it's very clear about how you can endorse this. But what the person has to do is say, how disturbed am I by these symptoms? And when you have face-valid measures with these other measures that have the built-in sort of ability scales, you're sort of controlling for that response bias error. You're controlling for that individual to sort of over-exaggerate. But then what you do with that test, because this is, we're not just administering them like robots, is you go and you do a clinical assessment. And that's what I did. I took what she wrote, what she endorsed on that test in January of 2021, and I did a clinical assessment of those symptoms to see if they meet criteria for PTSD. That is something we do clinically, and I do in my office all the time. And yes, she did meet PTSD from that in January 2021.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Curry said you misinterpreted her test results. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree that I agree that I interpreted them, that she misinterpreted them.
Okay. And please explain.
Yes. So I said that before. My stance on the MMPI and how she interpreted it is, I believe, wrong, and I think
objection, Your Honor.
All right.
That's the issue we just addressed.
All right.
I don't.
If you want to approach.
Now, Dr. Hughes, Dr. Curry also testified that a victim of PTSD has to effectively be prone and unable to function at all. Would you agree with that?
Objection misstates the evidence.
Oh, she said they couldn't hike, they couldn't move, they couldn't function in any way, shape, or form.
Objection.
Thank you.
No, that is not correct. That is often actually a myth and misconception about individuals who are struggling with PTSD or trauma-based disorders, and I'm often called to answer that and speak to that. People who are struggling with trauma and PTSD are very strong, courageous, resilient people, even though that they're struggling. They get up, they have to go to work and drop their kid off at school and go to the market, even though they're struggling with these symptoms. So I often talk about it as this sort of walking around with a 50-pound bag of flour on their backs, just sort of trying to get through the day, where sometimes that button's going to press play and the trauma's going to start activating in their head, and then they're going to be having to think about it and have startle and have physiological reactions until they can find a way to hit that pause and shut it off again. So they still have, impairments in other ways, but they go about their lives. They're not, totally debilitated. If you have someone in that high range, the highest score is an 80 on the CAPS, Ms. Heard had a 28. If you have someone in the higher range, we have seen people who are, severely disabled because of it, but that's not the norm of people who have this moderate PTSD.
And did you find functional impairment with Amber?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, Dr. Curry also said that it is not within the scope of a psychologist to evaluate domestic violence. Do you agree with that?
Of course, I don't agree with that. This is what I do for a living, day in, day out, for 25 years. We are specifically trained to understand the profound impact that trauma has on people's lives. That's what we do in the trauma division of the American Psychological Association. We disseminate that knowledge. And domestic violence is one of those profound traumas. Domestic violence is part of state licensing boards, that you can't get licensed in some states unless you take training on domestic violence. You can't renew your license unless you get training on domestic violence. So people who have, specialized training in this area, it is, beholden upon them to accurately assess for intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And it's more important to assess for the sort of scientific understanding of what domestic violence is. So you have to assess for the physical violence, the psychological violence, the surveillance, the economic, the emotional abuse, and the sexual violence. That is not gratuitous. That is
Objection.
understanding.
Narrative.
All right. Next question. Let's take a question.
Okay. Now, Dr. Curry suggested that you made a determination just based on personal opinion and just on checklists and a couple of tests that you misinterpreted. Would you agree with that?
I vehemently disagree with that. As I stated to you, over 29 hours and 12 psychological tests and reviewing a slew of documents in this case, most importantly, therapy records and interviews, collateral interviews with therapists. Using all that data, that is what a solid forensic methodological exam looks like. And then I made my conclusions based on my clinical education, knowledge, and training to come up with a professional expert opinion.
Okay. And just to remind, to make sure we're reminded here, you were qualified in this court, in this case, as an expert in forensic psychology, specifically in domestic violence and in no, I just lost it. And in violence, correct? Intimate, and in trauma, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the record.
Yeah, if you want to ask the question again.
Yeah, I probably should do that. You were qualified. I got to find my note. You were qualified as an expert in forensic psychology with a specialty in domestic violence and in trauma, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that was in this case?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, do you still hold the same opinions you did that you gave the jury earlier?
Yes, I do.
And do you still hold them within a reasonable degree of psychological probability and certainty?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
All right. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor, but can we approach quickly?
Sure.